70 AD was a catastrophic, massive event in the life of the church, because the church got swept up. The church was birthed in Jerusalem, and when Jerusalem was literally torn down brick by brick and leveled by the Romans didn't really care much about distinguishing between Jews, proper Jews, and Christians. They just kill them all and let the gods sort them out, right? And so the destruction of Jerusalem was massive, obviously, from a Jewish perspective. And again, the destruction of Jerusalem happened as a result of a Jewish revolt against Rome from 66 AD to 70 AD. It was a 4-year war. Essentially, the Jews, this tiny little country, took on the Roman Empire and actually came somewhat close to winning. For 4 years, they wiped out several Roman legions. It's a fascinating story in a terrible kind of way, but it ends very badly for everybody. So Rome destroys Jerusalem. Every single synagogue in Palestine they tear to the ground. They forbid any Jewish people from living in Jerusalem. They rename the city. They level the city in every possible way. So, of course, Jews are scattered, and Jewish Christians are scattered all throughout the Mediterranean world. And in many ways, this becomes the scattering of the seeds of the church as well, even though Paul had already begun his... What's going on here? Paul had already begun his missionary journeys, but it really forced the church out of Jerusalem and into the rest of the Mediterranean world. And it effectively ended the age of the apostles. All of the apostles were executed at this time, except for the apostle John. Right? But the church continued to spread and grow rapidly. The Christians, we're going to talk about a period of time this morning from 70 AD to 300 AD, when Christians had a really difficult time of it, had no political power, not persecuted all the time, but much of the time. And I just think it's encouraging to remind ourselves that we worship the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and the God of Paul and James and John, and the God of Susan and Darren and Chris and Ellie. This is the same God, right? The same Holy Spirit. They were receiving the same grace from God, the same interaction with the Holy Spirit in really difficult circumstances. So I just think the more that we can identify with them, I think the better, right? This great cloud of witnesses who have gone before us. So most of the converts to the church, the early Christian church at this time, are actually Gentiles. There were many Jewish converts too. You can imagine, with the total catastrophe of the Jewish system, many Jews did come to Christ. But most of the converts were actually Gentiles, and many of them came from the population of Rome, of slaves, of women, of soldiers, merchants, just common people. We do have instances of people highly placed in the Roman government who also came to faith, but the majority of people were very ordinary people. And one of the ways that the church distinguished itself from society was the way in which it cared for babies, the way it cared for widows, the way it cared for the poor, the way it cared for people who were on the down and outs with society. Essentially, the love that it displayed throughout Roman society, which was a pretty cruel place. So I think it's really important to talk about. It's easy to forget how absolutely radical the revolution was that Jesus brought to the world, right? to a very cruel Roman world, and how dramatically it challenged that very powerful but very cruel Roman world. Anybody else need notes? A few more people have come in. There's 2 pages here. Anybody else? So I just think it's important that we remind ourselves of this. This was a world, the Roman Empire, that not only had no qualms with the strong preying on the weak, it was thought normal and natural and right for the strong to prey upon the weak. Men over women, adults over children, the able-bodied over the sick or the weak or the deformed. And again, we've told this story before, but Caesar boasted of slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving 1 million more, and they held parades to celebrate this kind of thing. This was just the way of the world in the Roman Empire, right? And we're going to talk quite a bit this morning about Roman sexual politics. Their views of sex followed the same logic as their views of everything else. It was a tool that the powerful used over the powerless. So any adult Roman male was perfectly free under Roman law to do whatever he wanted to do to anyone in his household, whether that was women or children or slaves. Young boys, powerful Roman men were thought to be strange if they did not keep boys as sexual slaves. Children did not have full personhood in Rome. They could be killed, they could be abandoned, they could be treated as sexual slaves. Roman law actually encouraged parents to dispose of, to kill. We talked about the use of words this morning, right? To kill maimed children or children who weren't typical in some way. And this was just what was celebrated in Rome. So Greek gods were rapacious and violent and bloodthirsty and fickle and amoral. And so successful people in society, strong people, you assumed that if you had achieved a position of success in society, it's because the gods had smiled upon you. And so you want to be like the gods. And in their minds, the gods obviously made men superior to women, made adults superior to children, made masters superior to slaves, made the rich superior to the poor, made the strong superior to the weak. So again, we have such a hard time placing ourselves in this mindset because our mindset has been so radically transformed in the West and in the wider world by the revolution that Jesus brought. But today we have lots of marches in Washington for this group or that group who feels disenfranchised or trampled on. Those kind of marches in Rome would have elicited only laughter and mockery, right? Because that's the way the world is supposed to be. So, thoughts on this?
That's horrible.
It is horrible. You're right. Yeah.
Isn't this a lot similar to some of the world today?
Well, you're absolutely right. Places in the world today where Christianity has not had a leavening effect or a salting effect, it's still very much this way. That's right. Yeah.
It's interesting how much of an aversion our culture has to all of those things, to the point where the people with the most power are the ones who claim some brand of victimhood. Mm-hmm. So who would have ever predicted, looking historically, that victims would have the highest pedestal and the biggest stick to beat people around them with?
Right.
It's almost like we could almost become suspicious that the Marxists are using our values against us.
Well, so the term I like is to describe our modern situation is the victimhood Olympics, right? Like who can claim the worst degree of victimhood is actually a means of power today. That would have gotten zero traction in Rome, less than zero traction. The reason that does get traction today is because we live in a legacy of Christendom where God himself, we're going to move into this, God himself took on weakness, hung out with the poor and powerless, and was executed on a Roman cross. And when Paul says that was foolishness to the Greeks, that's what he meant. It was foolishness that God would hang out or identify himself with the sufferings of the weak and the powerless. The totally radical idea that self-sacrifice, the sacrifice of Jesus, could actually triumph over worldly power, right? And in so doing, Jesus, the message of Jesus eventually brings down that whole system. It undermines it in this slow motion underground atomic bomb that eventually radically changes the Roman world and eventually the Western world and eventually all of the world that it touches in such a way that, Buck, as you said, even our heresies today, Marxism, is a Christian-shaped heresy, right? Marxism, which triumphs the elevating, supposedly, right? Supposedly it puts the weak in positions and brings down the strong. But that Marxism would have been unintelligible to Roman people. Right? That would have had no purchase on their minds at all. Does that make sense? So the radical life of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus set off a political earthquake, not just a spiritual one. I think that's one of the main points I want to make, is it changed the actual world, not just people's hearts. It radically changed society. Does that make sense? In ways that we are so accustomed to it that we don't realize how radical the change was. The world cannot ever unsee or unhear what it has heard and seen in Jesus. Right? So many, this is, I firmly believe this to be true. Many values and practices which today in much of the world are thought to be simply normal or neutral or natural are proving to be anything but that, right? Prohibitions on perverse sexual practices or predatory sexual practices, clear lines separating sexual activity between adults and children, killing unwanted babies, eugenics. All of these things are making a comeback as the Christian tide recedes, or in the places where the Christian tide is receding. Might makes right. As we move into increasingly in the West, as we move into a post-Christian era, we're running on fumes, and even fumes don't last forever, right? So we're seeing a receding tide of these values in many places in the West as that capital has gotten drained and not replaced. Does that make sense?
It's difficult to argue then for that if you're not arguing from really a biblical standard.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so if you're still trying to take the Bible out of the conversation,
Mm-hmm.
and people will still want to argue it,
Right.
it makes it tough when they say, well, you can't use the Bible for argument.
Right.
You still want to hold these somewhat.
Right. Christian values. There was liberalism was a concerted effort to remove Jesus and keep his value system, but ultimately, when you you cut the branch out from under you, you're eventually going to fall down, right? So there is no well, we're going to talk about this more in a second. The modern prophet who articulated this better than anybody probably is Nietzsche, and we're going to talk about him a little bit. But yeah, the teachings of Jesus and the other biblical writers regarding sex and women and children and slaves was truly a radical challenge to the Roman system. The view brought by Jesus, and of course, this view is also present in the Old Testament. Jesus is the fulfillment of this, but the value of all human life, because of course you go back to Genesis 1 and 2 for this, right? But this idea was radical in Roman society and transformational. The idea that every human is made in God's image, that every human being matters, that as Paul said, the body is sacred and potentially a temple for the Holy Spirit. That was a radical threat to Rome's political system, right? Where the strong triumph over the weak because they're supposed to. Does that make sense? So in modern times, we're often told that the Christian view of sex is prudish, or that it's reactionary, or that we want to go back in time, that it's demeaning to women. This is such an ignorance of the reality of history and the reality of how the world works. In reality, Christianity brought a radical new dignity to women and children and the oppressed, and dramatically improved the lives of women and children and the oppressed. So the modern assault on Christian values and Christian moral ethics and Christian sexual ethics in favor of absolute freedom, it's not going to end well for women and children and the weak. Thoughts on this?
I think you see that today, even without not being actually able to define what a woman is, and allowing
Right.
men into spaces that have been protected for women.
Right.
The women are the ones who
Right.
pay that.
Right. Yeah. It's absolutely right. Did you guys hear what she said? That the modern push to allow men into women's restrooms and women's sports, it's not actually good for women, right? Right. So the modern individual who probably does the most articulate job of expressing this situation is a guy named Friedrich Nietzsche. So for 2,000 years in the West, very few thinkers actually challenged, I would say, the fundamental core of the Christian moral ethic, of care for the weak. And Nietzsche was one of the first Western thinkers prominently to do this. He lived from 1844 to 1900. He was a German. He was son of a Lutheran pastor. He had a great admiration for Greek and Roman society, and he called Christianity, his famous term for it was a slave religion, a slave morality. He pined for the days of Rome, when the glory and the might of Rome, when the strong ruled over the weak, as nature made them to do. And probably no Western thinker has been quite so honest and forthright in an attempt to pull out the pillars of Christianity from under Western civilization, and to welcome the replacement of it with something quite different. Nietzsche is the guy who coined the phrase "God is dead." He didn't actually mean God used to be alive and then he died. He meant God used to be the most important reality in Western civilization, and now that is evaporating. And he actually was quite clear-eyed in realizing that if you pull out the pillars of Christianity, something is going to have to come into that vacuum to replace it, right? And he made it one of his life's goals to think through what kind of values could replace Christian values in Western society. He knew, and in this sense, I think he was quite prescient, that he knew that Western morality could not very long survive the death of God. The fumes are eventually going to be expended, and it's going to have to be replaced by some new, or in his preference, some ancient God. If God is dead, some terrible new beast is going to have to replace him. And so the Enlightenment, we'll get into more of what the Enlightenment is later, but the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement in the 1700s to keep a lot of the values of Christianity, but to get rid of Jesus and the Bible as sources of authority, to keep the values of human rights, perhaps, and independent thinking. And he mocked this effort to get rid of the Bible and the teachings of Christianity and just keep the good stuff that we like. He said that's not going to work. These values didn't come from the Enlightenment, and they're not going to survive. He says the Enlightenment delusion that the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, he said, look around you, all men are clearly not created equal. Men are different in ability and physical strength and mental capacity and productive capacity. And he said equality is not self-evident. And he sided with Caesar, who said, no, men aren't created equal. Some men are created to rule other men. Strong men are created to rule weak men. He coined the phrase the Übermensch, which is German for the Superman. This is the strong man who, by right, should rule the weak and direct society according to his own principles. Thoughts on this?
What was the response of the church to Nietzsche during that period?
Yeah, Nietzsche actually didn't get a lot of traction while he was alive from Christians or nominal Christians or non-Christians. He died in poverty. I think he had a sister who kept his writings and then got them published after he was dead, and that's when they began to get more traction. And they got their most traction from the Nazis. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So the Nazis, of course, a German movement, very much liked the doctrine of Nietzsche. The Nazis picked up on this theme that concern for the weak poisons society. It's Christian compassion that keeps weak people alive and reproducing. This kind of compassion weakens the nation because it persuades strong people to shelter the weak, and that weakens the nation, right? Nietzsche said, in the days before mankind grew ashamed of its cruelty, life on earth was more cheerful. For whom?
Yeah.
Right? This is a whom problem, right? This is another quote from Nietzsche. In ancient ages, before Christianity had come to the forests of pagan Germany, real men lived like lions. He called them blonde beasts. But then the missionaries came, spreading their disease of compassion for the weak. The blonde beast, Nietzsche said, the blonde beast now lay sick, wretched, hating himself, filled with suspicion to all that was still strong and happy. Can you see why this was a worldview that was attractive to the Nazis? And it fit very well with what? it fit very well with another contemporary of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was 15 years old when Charles Darwin published his Origin of the Species, and it was very influential on Nietzsche because it gave this scientific endorsement to the idea that nature intends for the strong to dominate the weak and to prevail over the weak, right? Whether or not the gods have favored us, nature certainly has, if we're the strong ones. And so eugenics was something that was downstream of you know what eugenics is, right? It's the effort to, yeah, go ahead, Les.
Define eugenics.
Yeah, eugenics is the effort, so it's actually a Greek word. Eu means good, and genics is from our terms for genetics, right? Same root word. So it's trying to produce human genetics that are good and not flawed. So today, if you do a prenatal screening on your child and the doctor tells you there might be something wrong with it, and you can eliminate it if you want to. Eliminate, that's a word, a euphemistic word. That's eugenics. But eugenics was a very strong movement in the early 1900s that actually got a lot of traction in Western society of sterilizing certain people, eliminating, trying to eliminate weakness from human genetics and just leave strong people, right? Weeding out weaker human beings, right? A modern prophetess of eugenics was Margaret Sanger, who said in 1921, the most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the overfertility of the mentally and physically defective. She is the founder of Planned Parenthood.
What does that mean?
Means people who aren't smart or strong or physically strong or mentally strong should not be allowed to reproduce, and we need to get rid of them as quickly as possible. Yeah. All of this, maybe conscious isn't the right word, but it was a refuting of Christian ethics and Jesus' care for the weak, which for 2,000 years had been the basic ethic of Western society. Not that it was lived out perfectly in any sense. We're not making the claim that widows and orphans have been treated perfectly in Christian societies for 2,000 years. We know that's not true, but this was an attempt to tear down that ideal, even the ideal itself. Does that make sense? So the Nazis drew inspiration both from Charles Darwin and from Friedrich Nietzsche. The German term for Kaiser is actually a Germanization of the Latin word for Caesar. Hitler initially tried to. This feels like a detour, and we're jumping way ahead in history. We kind of are, but I think this illustrates. I'm trying to illustrate the radical transformation that happened in the first 300 years of the church, setting that against this vision of human ethics and morality. They were very happy to pick up on this idea of the Übermensch, the Superman, right, who was not chained down by this slave morality that Christianity brought. Again, they claimed a scientific endorsement from Darwinism. Himmler described Darwinism as a cool doctrine of reality based on the most incisive scientific knowledge.
How is he using the word cool?
Yeah.
Reason and
Rational. That's what he means, is not going to get our hearts all inflamed by this compassion stuff. we're going to be cool-minded and weeding out the weak, right? Right. Yeah. Himmler, who was Hitler's leader of the SS, did draft a 50-year plan to totally eradicate Christianity in the Third Reich. And again, what foul soil could possibly have bred or been a seedbed for Christianity? It was Jewish dirt, right? The Nazis, they had great disdain for Paul's statement that there's no Jew or Greek in Christ, right? Thoughts on this?
I think it's interesting that with Darwinism, it only leads to a deep, deep depravity of depression. And also with Nazis, it had the same elements. And so it just shows how if you're not mindfully in the Word and have that foundation, it can lead to really awful, dark truths.
Right, right. Yeah, you can see why, at least if you're on the upper side of society, how these ideas could be attractive in some perverse way, right?
It's logical. If you take God out of the equation, everything they say makes perfect sense.
Right,
Because you're untethered from morality.
right,
You're untethered from what God says is valuable and what God says is right.
right.
Once you shove that aside, this is where it leads.
Yeah, then the cross looks
Necessarily, this is where it goes. If you have any logical thinking whatsoever, this is what you end up with. And that's why Nietzsche was talking about God is dead, we have killed him. He wasn't celebrating that. He was not celebrating the inevitable result of that. Because this is what it was.
Right, right. Yeah, it was foolishness to the Greeks, right? Yeah, Newton.
Words do matter. 20 years ago, or less, maybe much less, a football team developed a more effective offense. And now everything has evolved. A football team has evolved a more effective offense. This is a change in language that has taken place in your youngest child's lifetime. The word develop, listen, you'll hear it used very, very seldom. We still talk about R&D, but nobody knows what D is. It's really like R&E, research and evolution, rather than development. This has taken place in a few years.
I'd like to say something.
Yeah, Patsy.
I do what they do because if a person's not a Christian, or if a person curses a lot, or is behaving wrongly and all that, I eradicate them out of my life, and that's basically the same thing. I eradicate all these people. I think that's the right word. And when you're teaching this, it's showing me that, I'm doing it.
Yeah, we can all think of people in our lives that we would rather live without, right?
And that we make it a part of our life not to have anything to do with them.
Yeah, no, you're right, Yeah, in a sense, the Jesus call to love is not a natural human fleshly response, is it? Yeah, it requires the power of the Holy Spirit. Right? Someone said, Ross Douthat said this, if you don't like the Christian rite, You don't want to see the post-Christian right. By the right, meaning these terms are sometimes helpful, sometimes not, but the sense that power and might is the thing. You can see lots of this stuff on Twitter, a resurgence of the idea that to make society strong, we've got to weed out the weak, right? I really believe one of the greatest antidotes to combating either left-wing, what we would call wokeism, or godless right-wing ideologies like the Nazis. One of the greatest antidotes to combating these things, these extreme ideologies among Christian young people or Christian people in general, is simply understanding the history of the West and the history of what Christianity has brought, the revolution that Jesus brought to the world. Right? Okay, we're gonna take a pretty strong, yeah.
I just had a question. For people who are not in the church, what do they attribute the change to? They would, I don't think they would say it's Christianity. What would they say the change from the Roman world to?
Yeah, I think most people would just think it's normal. It's normal and natural to be nice to people, right?
It comes from the God within them.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
that's true.
And again, most people would be ignorant of. You can travel lots of places in the world where it's still like this, right? Did somebody else raise their hand, have a thought? Okay, we're going to take a pretty sharp turn from that conversation now. So the spread of the early church, we're still talking about from the years 70 AD to 300 AD. By the late 200s AD, so 250 years after Jesus, no major population center in the entire Roman Empire lacked a Christian presence. Here's a map. I'll show an enlarged picture of this map. The strongest areas of the early church were in what is modern-day Italy, modern-day Syria, modern-day Turkey, where Paul's missionary journeys were, and then North Africa was a major center of the church. There were many martyrs. The church was still a unified body at this point. There were not separate denominations like we think of today. This is a martyr is someone who's killed for their faith by the government, usually by the government, because they're Christian. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, this is North Africa. This is Asia, modern-day Turkey. The darker red areas are the extent of Christianity around 300, and then the lighter brown is the spread of Christianity from 300 to 600 AD. The Silk Road to China opened in 106 BC, linking China and the Far East to Europe, actually. At the same time as the Romans were building this massive road system, the Persians also had quite a stable government, and it was a stable period in China as well. And so there were these great road systems that were developed. Law and order was developed in a new way in Persia and China and Rome and the Roman Empire. And so in many ways, this prepared a path for the gospel to go forward and to go out. So a lot of people, I wasn't aware of this for a long time, the early church in the East, and I mean East all the way to China, was very, very, very early on. This is within the first 600 years of Christianity. The Persian church was a very developed church and was sending missionaries, again, over the Silk Road into China. We have very early architecture, or not architecture, but very early archaeological findings of Christianity very early in India and China. These aren't things you read about in the Bible because it was written, these things occurred after the canon was closed. But tradition has Thomas going east while Paul went west. And there's pretty good evidence that Thomas made it as far as the east coast, the far coast of India before he died. The very, very old churches that were established in India within 100 years of Christ. And in fact, the church went east much more rapidly than it went west. There were historians are pretty clear on this, that there were more Christians in Asia and Africa at the year 1000 AD than there were in the West. So often it's thought that Christianity just went west, but that's not actually true. Christianity reached India, Ethiopia, and China before it reached England. We don't have time to talk about it probably, but there's some really fascinating archaeological finds in Xi'an, China, which was the capital of China. The city of Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire, which was still the largest world power at the time. The church in Rome became very influential over the general church. The church in the Eastern church was split in many ways from the Western church because Rome was at war with Persia. They were pretty fierce enemies, and so it wasn't as easy to travel from east to west because of the conflict between the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. But it developed independently quite rapidly on its own. Over 30,000 Christians in Rome. What made Christianity so distinct? What made it stand out so much in the Roman Empire? The way that Christians treated their neighbors was an implicit criticism of Roman pagan life. This radical new view that we talked about of slaves and women and children and orphans and the vulnerable. As you would expect, the church had lots and lots and lots of women in it. Women who are refugees from a pretty cruel system, right? And you even get glimpses of this when you read what was one of the first challenges in the book of Acts is, what do we do with all of these? We're having a hard time logistically caring for this many widows, because there were a lot of widows and women who were refugees from probably awful situations who were coming into the church, right? To the extent that they had to come up with logistical ways to meet these needs physically. In Paul's writings, you hear him talk about situations for unmarried women who have children and divorcees and all of these different situations. How does the church practically care for these people, right? This is, I wish I could remember who said, I think this quote came from Oliver O'Donovan. He said, the church doesn't just have a social and political program. The church is a social and political program. What does that mean?
It is for the a positive. Is it a positive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Built into the teaching of Jesus who said to love, you can't love God and not love your neighbor, right? I mean, that's the first great commandment, right? Love God and love your neighbor. That comes baked in as a way of caring for our neighbor, right? Caring for the people around us. It's not just that the church has to develop a philosophy for politics and social a social program. The church is inherently cares for people, human beings, right? You can't, if you try to carve that off from the church, you're carving it off from the actual teachings of Jesus, right? I think it's helpful just to look at a couple of actual Christians from this time period to kind of get again, these people from the mists, the hazy mist of history, but these were real people. Polycarp was a Christian who lived from 69 AD to 155 AD. He was, as a young man, a disciple or an apprentice of the Apostle John. He became the bishop of Smyrna, the same Smyrna that you read about in Revelation chapter 2. He was burned at the stake by Rome because he refused to once a year burn incense to Caesar. He was burned at the age of 86. He said at his execution, he said, "For 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my King and Savior?" We have, I believe it was Eusebius, who was the first early historian of the church, who tells us about the lives of some of these people. Rodney Stark, who's a well-respected historian of early Christianity, he estimates the number of Christians grew by 40% each decade for the first and second centuries. So basically from Acts to the year 200 AD, it was growing 40% per decade. That's pretty exponential amount of growth, right?
Is that simple interest or compound?
I can't tell you that. And in the post-apostolic church, that is the church after the apostles died, bishops emerged as overseers of larger urban Christian populations, and there was a sort of organically a hierarchy of church leadership structure came to exist. Episcopos, or our English word for that is bishop. Presbyters is the Greek word for elders, and then deacons, which literally means servant, diakonos. So this structure, we don't know a lot about how these decisions were made. Paul does use all of these terms, right, in 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, but a fairly organized structure emerged in spite of all of the headwinds that the church was dealing with at this time. Thoughts about this or questions about this?
That's wrong though, isn't it?
What's wrong?
What they're doing is wrong, isn't it?
Hierarchy? Well, I would...
I know there's religions now that still do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, every human organization has some form of hierarchy. My kids go to a school and there's a hierarchical, there's a school board, there's a superintendent, there's principal, there's teachers. I don't think actually human organizations can exist without some form of hierarchical structure, right? Hierarchy can go badly. We know how human sin can infect hierarchies and make people tyrannize other people, but I think sometimes we're a very anti-authoritarian society, so we think hierarchy is automatically bad. I don't think the Bible views it that way. If anybody who's in a work situation where you have more than being your own boss and having no employees, you're probably going to exist in some form of hierarchy, right?
What do you think Christianity brought in? How did that affect the medical field?
Yeah.
I'm assuming,
Yeah.
the
So,
strong versus the weak.
so the word hospital came from a Christian group called the Hospitaliers. The first hospitals were made by Christians. Again, these were attempts to build institutions. Again, we don't like the word institution very much, but it's institutions that can keep things going. We don't get up every morning and figure out what's a new way to educate our kids, right? We don't try to reinvent the wheel every morning. We have educational institutions because they have the ability to sustain things over time. And Christians started building institutions in society like hospitals, like orphanages, like all the institutional things which get messy because they involve human beings. But
A good explanation of hierarchy, could it be the governing body of a structure?
Yeah, a governing body that structures the organization of any kind of group, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry to ask.
Yeah. No, that's all right.
But mental health,
Mm-hmm.
they have eliminated all the places where people can go
Mm-hmm.
if they're mentally ill.
Mhm.
And now, they're out on the streets and everywhere else, and
Mm-hmm.
what is that?
Yeah, it's a very difficult problem to solve, and it sometimes seems like our system doesn't work very well. But I have lived in other places in the world where people were truly mentally ill people wandering around, eating out of garbage cans, naked, all the time, everywhere. So as frustrated as we are with our system sometimes, they are better than having no system. And there are many places in the world that have no systems for these kind of things. Yeah. So this is really interesting. We have a surviving document, a letter between the Emperor Trajan, who was the emperor in 112 AD, so 90 years after or so after the death and resurrection of Jesus, to a provincial governor. I think he was in, well, I'm not sure where he was at, somewhere in the Roman Empire. Pliny was the governor, and Pliny has been trying to deal with this pesky problem of Christians in his province. And Pliny writes a letter to the Emperor Trajan asking for advice on how to deal with this Christian problem. And these are two pagans writing about Christians, but it's instructive. Pliny says, in dealing with Christians, he says, I've asked the accused if they were Christians. If they said yes, I asked them a second and third time, warning them. If they persisted, I ordered execution. Later, as usually happens, the trouble spread by the very treatment of it. So for him, the trouble is Christians, right? Some denied that they were Christians. They invoked the gods, the pagan gods, and did reverence with incense to your image, to Caesar, which I had brought along for the purpose. They also cursed Christ. These were people who denied their faith under pain of execution. People who are really Christians cannot possibly be made to do any of those things. I thought to inquire into the real truth of the matter by subjecting to torture 2 female slaves called deaconesses, but I found nothing more than a perverse superstition, which I'm sure he meant that the resurrection of this guy Jesus from the dead. The number of those who were accused, many of every age, every class, high and low, of both sexes, are being accused and will continue to be accused. Nor has this contagious superstition spread through the cities only, but also through the villages and the countryside. The temples, meaning the temples to Roman gods, had been well nigh abandoned. This is just a really fascinating little window into what was going on, right, in one particular province of the Roman Empire. The empire was, the Roman Empire was increasingly racked by convulsions. There was troubles with succession. They didn't have a good way of figuring out who the next emperor will be, right? There's lots and lots of murder and court intrigue and assassinations and succession troubles, right? Who's going to succeed the current emperor? Who's going to be the next emperor? There were issues with civil wars in Rome. There were plagues. Because of these road systems, they were getting diseases from globally. They were getting a lot more plagues. And the barbarians were chipping away at the hinterlands of the empire. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, most people took as a sign that the gods were angry with the empire, that they must be doing something wrong. We must not be doing proper worship of our Roman pagan gods. Whose fault is this? Right? And perhaps it's the fault of the Christians. They are not good citizens of Rome. They're anti-empire. They're not good patriots. They don't worship our gods, and so the gods are angry, and we need to find somebody to blame for this. Just a quick note on Vesuvius. Has anybody traveled to Italy? And I just talked, was that last year? We're talking to some friends who did a tour of Vesuvius where they've excavated this perfectly preserved stuff because all this ash just dumped on the town instantly, and everybody was frozen in their whatever they were doing at the moment, right? And they gave this tour of I don't have kids in the room, right? Of this, they described it almost like what we'd think of as like a strip mall, except it's made out of stone. and there's various little shops, and you can go and see this today. Over each shop is a carved picture of the perverse sexual act that you can do for money in the shop. And there's children, there's boys, there's anything you can possibly imagine and shouldn't. This was very much out in the open, and this was, it was a sex shop for wealthy Romans, right? And all of this is preserved. And again, the point of it was unembarrassed and open and involved lots of children and lots of slaves. And you can go see these things today. And there appears to be an active attempt to return to the values of Rome. So, we're almost done here. In 250 AD, so the persecution in the first 300 years was somewhat uneven. Sometimes it was quite intense. Sometimes it was less intense. In 250, there was an intensification of, again, as the empire was destabilizing in many ways, and Christians increasingly became scapegoats for this. There was an empire-wide decree that there was an increasing strictness that everybody had to do this, right? To show, to pay a pinch of incense to Caesar and to demonstrate their faithfulness to their Roman pagan gods. And everybody was able to comply with this, except for Jews weren't either, but Jews and Christians, right? Were the two groups of people who refused to comply with this. And it led to an intensification of persecution in the late 200s. Origen, who was one of the great writers, thinkers of the early church, he he mused on a fantastical, impossible dream. What if one day one of the Caesars could actually be won for Christ? How crazy would that be, right? It seemed too ridiculous to even imagine such a thing happening. The Emperor Diocletian, who lived from 245 to 312, mandated some of the most intense persecution in the entire Roman Empire. And Emperor Diocletian led right up to, guess who? Constantine. We'll talk about Constantine next week. Yeah. Thoughts on any of this? Yeah.
It took 270 years for that to happen.
Which is basically Newton said it took 270 years for this to happen. America is how old? 250 years next, in 2 years, right? So this is, what we've been talking about is the whole history of the United States, or the U.S. as a nation, as an independent nation, right? So God takes the long view. I put on the back of this is a great thing to close with. Can you hand me someone sent to me a talk on Psalm 37, and I just thought this was really perfect because, yeah, it's easy to be discouraged, it's easy to be alarmed. There are discouraging and alarming things happening. But this is written by a politician, King David, a person who was very involved in politics his whole life. His early life being chased around, running for his life from a king. He says in this psalm that he's writing this near the end of his life. He says this, "Fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light, and your justice as the noonday. Be still before the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. For the evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. In just a little while, the wicked will be no more." 270 years. Though you look carefully at his place, he will not be there. But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace. The wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes his teeth at him. But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he sees that his day is coming. The wicked draw the sword and bend their bows to bring down the poor and needy, to slay those whose way is upright. The sword shall enter their own heart, and their bows shall be broken. Better is the little that the righteous has than the abundance of many wicked. For the arms of the wicked shall be broken, but the Lord upholds the righteous. The Lord knows the day of the blameless, and their heritage will remain forever. They are not put to shame in evil times. In the days of famine, they have abundance. But the wicked will perish. The enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures. They vanish like smoke, they vanish away. The wicked borrows but does not pay back, but the righteous is generous and gives. For those blessed by the Lord shall inherit the land, but those cursed by him shall be cut off. The steps of a man are established by the Lord when he delights in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord upholds his hand. I have been young, and now I am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, or his children begging for bread. He is ever lending generously, and his children become a blessing. Turn away from evil and do good, so shall you dwell forever. For the Lord loves justice. He will not forsake his saints. They are preserved forever, but the children of the wicked shall be cut off. The righteous shall inherit the land and dwell upon it forever. The mouth of the righteous utters wisdom, and his tongue speaks justice. The law of his God is in his heart. His steps do not slip. The wicked watches for the righteous and seeks to put him to death. The Lord will not abandon him to his power or let him be condemned when he is brought to trial. Wait for the Lord and keep his way, and he will exalt you to inherit the land. You will look on when the wicked are cut off. I have seen a wicked, ruthless man spreading himself like a green laurel tree, but he passed away, and behold, he was no more. Though I sought him, he could not be found. Mark the blameless, and behold the upright, for there is a future for the man of peace. But transgressors shall be altogether destroyed. The future of the wicked shall be cut off. The salvation of the righteous is from the Lord. He is their stronghold in the time of trouble. The Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them because they take refuge in him. Seems like a good way to close, right? Oh. Amen. Have a good week.